Hello, and welcome back to part 3 of the third in a series on the Johannite tradition, this one being called The Primitive Church in the Modern Age. And if you're just joining us anew, my name is Shaun McCann, and I'll be going through this presentation. Now, as I mentioned, there are two parts previous in the overall series, and that's Johannite tradition part 1 and part 2. The first part is on the community of the beloved disciple and the principles that connect to the Johannite church in the present day, and of course Johannite tradition part 2, which explores the modern legend of a medieval Johannite church. Part 3, of which this talk is the third part, explores the actual foundation or refoundation of the primitive church and the order of the temple in the modern age in the early 19th century by Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. So if you haven't listened to the previous two parts in this third talk, or the previous two parts in the overall stream of lectures, I highly recommend you do so in order to get the most benefit out of it. So thank you again for joining us. This is a little bit of a marathon, so it's best that we just kind of buckle in and get going. We now move into section 3 of this incredibly long talk. And the previous two sections, the first section was on the background and context in which the primitive church and the order of the temple came about, some of the key figures and dates in that refoundation of the primitive church and the order of the temple, and of course some central controversies in the form of the two things that the refoundation presented to the world as a part of its claims, being that of the Charter of Larminius, a documentation of lineage, and of course the Gospels according to the primitive church, the essentially claimed original version of the Gospel of John, as it were. So section 3 is going to be on the structure and elements found within the Holy Eucharist or Mass of the primitive church, of the Johannite church, as it is relayed in the documents from the early 19th century. So let's have a look, shall we? As we know from our previous explorations around the catechism and teaching for the order of the priesthood and the order of Levite pontiff, the 8th and 9th degrees of these combined organizations, the primitive church and order of the temple has three central sacraments, being baptism, the Eucharist, and priesthood. That's not to say, as I mentioned, that's not to say that it doesn't observe other sacraments or sacramental rituals, which it does, and it acknowledges those the character of such, but that those three are kind of at the centerpiece of the work of what the church does. And without a doubt, just like other churches of its day and the present day and throughout history, the Eucharist is the jewel in the crown, as it were. So the Eucharist in this church, much like in other churches, is the central sacrament. So they do refer to their Mass, as a Eucharist, as a holy sacrifice, as communion. They use a range of terms, much in the same way that present-day churches and churches contemporary to the area refer to their central Eucharist. So I've used some of these terms interchangeably. Here, of course, I've got this labeled just straight up as the Mass, the holy sacrifice of the primitive church. And as we had looked previously at a rather kind of complex series of offices, officers, governing bodies, a set of 5 lodge degrees, a set of 9 overall degrees, there seems to be an elaborate amount of structure, I guess, or rungs on these various ladders. Now, bearing in mind the kind of complexity that they've brought to every stage and level of this organization, the actual ritual in terms of their central sacrament being the Mass, the holy sacrifice of the primitive church, is actually surprisingly simple. Uh, Point in fact that they have in the middle of their Eucharist, and I highlight this later, they have in the middle of the Eucharist, much like other churches in the present day do, they have the recitation of the creed. And the actual recitation of the creed itself, is actually longer than the ritual of the Mass. So I remember looking at this years ago, and when we were going through some of this material, thinking, okay, this ritual on its face, material-wise, seems kind of long, until you actually look at the straight-up translation of it, and it turns out the creed is longer than the rest of the ritual put together. So it's actually surprisingly simple for an overly complex set of organizations. So let's dig in here to the Mass. Now, of course, there's going to be a lot of recognizable elements here. There's nothing new under the sun, and this is certainly true when it comes to the Holy Mass in really any church, right? There's only so different you can make it and still call it a Mass. So there's a kind of still rough overarching continuity with the tradition of the Eucharist in Christianity. But there are a couple differences, I think, that also put it ahead of its time. At least as we would look at it sitting from where we are now, looking backwards into the past. So first up, the altar is placed on a platform as a part of liturgical preparation. And this should tell you one thing, that it's not a fixed altar. In other words, it's not sitting in the east as you would have in an ad orientem Mass or a Latin Mass. That kind of thing. So it's actually a freestanding platform, presumably a table or other movable altar, but it's not fixed. It means it's set up for the occasion. And then at the outset of the Mass, the Levites, that is to say, members of the varying other degrees of the primitive church and the order of the temple, presumably they mean officers and ranking officials, but I guess it would depend on what their attendance is like, because all the members were Levites to some degree, at least when it comes to the actual structure of the organization. Within the statutes, they don't do a lot of talking about the laity, so presumably because the 9 degrees are all referred to as Levites in some shape or form, you're dealing with anybody who has received one of the 9 degrees, minor orders or holy orders, or is a chevalier or knight within the order of the temple. So the altar is placed upon a platform, and it's not a fixed altar, and in a semicircle around the altar we have varying degrees of Levites. The liturgy itself is always celebrated versus populum, that is, standing east facing west. They're facing the people. Of course, a lot of us would, in a post-Vatican II, post-1960s era, if you're a Roman Catholic, or pretty much, any other church for the last century, celebrates Mass in this way. So this is a kind of familiar sight to all of us, where the priest faces the congregation while they undertake the ritual. That said, it is not a familiar sight in the context of a early 19th century church in Catholic France. So this appears to be a significantly early, comparative to the rest of the modern Christian era, innovation, as it were. In keeping with the rest of Christianity, of course, liturgy is celebrated either by a priest or a bishop. That's pretty consistent. The deacons, as noted from the Catechism, are the assistants to the priest, but they don't do Mass. They distribute communion. They assist the priest. They assist the members of the church in the order, but they do not actually administer the central rite itself. That, just like every other church, it's done by the priests and the bishops. The other thing within the text of the Mass, both in the preamble and in the actual rubrics and liturgy itself, the Eucharist is referred to throughout as a holocaust. That is to say, as a burnt offering, as in something you would have, for example, in the Temple of Jerusalem in the Old Testament, in Judaism. And I'm going to come back to this later. For those of you who are temple theology nerds, and talk a little bit about the Eucharist and, of course, the order in the church in the context of temple theology. I've already covered some of this in the second part in the overall series, Digging Under the Temple Mount, where we talk about the legend of a medieval church. I've talked about temple elements, and we're going to look at some temple elements here once we get concluded a walkthrough of the Mass, as it were. So the setup and preparatory action having been done, the Mass begins, and it begins like all Masses begin, usually with some kind of opening prayer. They follow it up with an offering of incense, and there is a lot of incense in the Mass of fabre-palaprat. Usually in Eucharists in the present day, you typically have two offerings of incense, one to cense the people in the sanctuary, and the other later on in the Mass to cense the altar and the elements for consecration. Here, there's 4 or 5 different offerings of incense, so this becomes a pretty smoky place. So the priest presents themselves despite their own unworthiness. This is a part of the prayer at the time. They present themselves, noting their own unworthiness, but stating their intent to offer sacrifice for the support of divine law, unity, charity of the people, and for eternal life. And I've put a note in here to make note of it, so I'm going to make note of it, that the whole idea of the intent to offer sacrifice for the support of divine law, unity, and charity of the people, and eternal life seems to ring to me kind of harmonious with temple theology and the idea of the Eucharist as the thing that maintains the covenant between the divine and the people of the divine, essentially the maintenance of the universe, as it were, in temple theology. After which the priest leaves the altar to go before the people to invoke a blessing. That is to say, they come around from the altar and go out to the people, either in front of the people or amongst the people. I don't recall it being very, very clear on which, and they invoke a blessing. The other thing to note here, regardless of how I refer to the priest throughout this, is that as we've seen from the structure of the order of the temple and the primitive church, that there were canonesses, and of course canons usually, typically, not always, but canons in the history of Western Christianity tend to be priests. So it's important to note that there's a strong likelihood, again, that the primitive church had women in major orders, specifically the priesthood. After invoking the blessing, standing in front of or in the midst of the people, the priest returns to the altar. Then at the right of the altar, a deacon reads from either an epistle or one of the Gospels of the primitive church. Nothing crazy here. Of course, there are a section for readings in almost every modern Mass, whether you're dealing with small O Orthodox churches or Gnostic churches, heterodox churches, as it were. You have an epistle and or a reading from the Gospel. In this case, of course, it's the Gospels according to the primitive church, the supposed original Gospel of John. After which the Levites, now it does say the Levites as opposed to a congregation, and like I said, it's not necessarily clear on the nature of any congregation for the Eucharist, and the Eucharistic ritual does note that there are Levites around the altar at the outset of the Mass. So then these Levites, these initiates, then offer a hymn, following which they are seated. Now, with this instruction, it makes me think that it is entirely possible that there weren't lay people as such in the primitive church, or rather, not that there weren't lay people, but rather that the Mass was offered for the benefit primarily internally as the membership of the organization. That essentially Mass was done by and for the Levites, right? So the Levites, it's entirely possible that the Levites here were the congregation, but they start off around the altar in harmony with the priest. So like I said, I don't have a whole lot of clarity to offer on that. That's just a very plain reading of the text, as it were. Now, then the priest begins by reciting what's called the symbolon, or the symbol of the apostolic faith, which is essentially the creed of the primitive church. And as I've noted prior, this is actually longer than the Mass itself. It is several pages in the text. I'm not going to go through line by line or paragraph of the creed. The reality is the creed of the primitive church essentially summarizes a lot of the major points that you find in the catechism of the primitive church in terms of the Trinity, being, action, and intelligence, following the Apostle John and the lineage, the sovereign pontiff as the central authority, the importance of reason together with faith, lots of those type of things. It's actually very Masonic sounding if you're familiar with the rituals or text of Freemasonry. But essentially, I hesitate to say it's a short form summary of anything because it's not a short form summary of anything. But essentially, it compiles and puts together the main kind of spiritual or religious principles of the primitive church into one place for long recitation by the priest. It's quite long. Following the symbol of the apostolic faith, the primitive church's creed, the priest will then give a homily or a sermon. So, of course, this is an element which you find in almost every modern church. Nothing crazy there. And after the homily or sermon, there's a period of contemplation or meditation, presumably where the Levites of the congregation spend some time thinking on the teaching that the priest has given through the homily or sermon. Following the meditation or contemplation on the sermon or homily, the Levites then lead the priest back to the altar. And here again, incense is offered, and then there is music. During this period, the bread and wine are brought to the altar by the Levites, as well as water, linens, and the other things needed for the ritual Mass. This, of course, is pretty much, I would say, similar to or parallel to what you find in the modern Eucharists in varying churches. It's functionally the offertory at the Mass. The gifts are brought up. The tools for the ritual are essentially placed out, and all this is done. Essentially, this interlude, as it were, is done with the presence of music throughout for the benefit of the people in the pews. So the priest then cleanses and purifies themselves and their hands, which is also similar to most Eucharists that you find at that time and in the present day. And then they lay a hand on each one of the elements, that is the bread and the wine, and offers prayer to note that the sacrifice of the Eucharist is an act of contrition or expiation and a token of salvation, so that the Eucharist itself, in addition to being a temple-type offering or holocaust, as they describe it, for the maintenance of the divine law, that it's also an act of contrition and salvation. So functionally, it's an act of reconciliation with the divine when you put it all together, using the different terms under which they describe the ritual. The Eucharist is seen as an act of reconciliation, in my opinion. Further, after this, there is, of course, another offertory and another prayer. After this additional prayer, the priest takes the cross from the altar and raises it up while offering intentions for the church, friends and enemies, as well as the well-being of others. So this kind of lines up with what you have in a lot of Eucharists, where you have what are called the prayers of the people, where essentially they pray for the leaders of their nation, they pray for their sick, they pray for other intentions that are submitted by members of the congregation, they pray for the church, so on and so forth. So there's an analog here. So the priest takes the cross from the altar, raises it, and offers prayer and intentions. Then, as a part of this action, the priest calls on those present to call to mind their faults and their contrition, and then pronounces absolution for all those who are contrite. This is no different from other masses where you have something that's called the penitential rite, where basically the priest asks all present to call to mind their sins, their errors, their ignorance. Of course, this language depends on what church you're in. And then on behalf of the divine, or as the representative of the divine, pronounces absolution and reconciles the people to God, such as it were. But there's a difference here. And this, of course, harkens back to some of the stuff that we talked about in the catechism material around the order of priests. The idea that the priest is to teach and instruct the faithful, but also to leave aside those, that they can leave in darkness, those who prove themselves unworthy. And there's an element of that here that comes into the penitential rite as found in the primitive church. So the priest calls on those present to call to mind their faults and their contrition, and pronounces absolution for all who are contrite, and binds retention on those who are not able to make themselves worthy of forgiveness. So essentially the action here is saying, if you are sorry, you are forgiven. If you are not sorry, you cannot be forgiven, essentially. And functionally you have that more or less, you have some of that kind of implied in the theology of outside churches around the concept of absolution. Not so much that they're binding them forever in their sin, but simply the idea that you can only be forgiven, you can only be absolved of your sins by a priest if you're actually sorry for them. In terms of actual sacramental theology, as you find it in the West, contrition is one of the elements that makes sacramental absolution possible. And if you're not sorry, the sacrament doesn't actually work. So there's an element of that here, where we have a more explicit difference between the primitive church and its day and other churches in its day or in the present day, is they are reminding you that this is the case. In other words, if you are sorry, you are absolved, but if you are not sorry, you are out of luck. So once that's all done and the people are prepared, and now typically in a lot of Eucharists, you have the penitential rite, usually closer to the beginning of the Mass. It depends on which Mass you're looking at, of course, and it's hard for me to give you a total survey of them in this talk. Let's face it, this talk is already long enough and potentially boring enough as is. So, but that said, generally the reason, one of the reasons why there's a penitential rite or a general absolution in most Eucharists is it's based on the idea of cleansing, reconciling, making whole, wiping clean, those kind of ideas. It is preparing the people of God before they receive the most holy thing that the church has to offer, so that nobody comes for communion in a state of unworthiness. So almost every Mass out there has a general absolution. Now, according to most churches' theologies, this is where confession comes in. That the ideal is that you are to confess your sins to a priest and make right with the divine and make right with the community before you actually go to Mass. But in terms of the general absolution in Mass, this also, I mean, let's put it frankly, this also covers the priest's basis, in the sense of the priest is not offering, the priest is at no danger of offering the sacrament to somebody who is unworthy, because everybody is given a clean slate prior to taking communion, including those who haven't come for specific confession. So the general absolution in Mass is designed to make sure that everybody is in a state to receive it. Now, I'm sure folks who are more strict along the lines of, say, Catholic or Anglican theology are going to disagree with my take on that. But that is kind of, my own opinion of it. That the general absolution, as found in most Eucharists, is a fail-safe to ensure that the Eucharist is offered to somebody who has been properly prepared. And the best way to prepare them in terms of the state of their own well-being is to have them absolved prior to taking communion. So all this preparation, offering of incense, offering of intention, offering of a homily, all that having been completed, the priest then pronounces the formula of consecration that we've discussed earlier, that comes from the sixth primitive gospel, or rather the sixth chapter of the Gospel of John, as opposed to the words of institution or the epiclesis, or conversely the epiclesis that you find in either Western or Eastern churches. The elements, the bread and wine, having been consecrated with the formula of consecration that the primitive church uses, the priest then, for the third time, offers incense with a recitation of additional prayers of offering. And in case you're not already choking on frankincense enough, there is now a fourth offering of incense prior to a pre-communion prayer. Pre-communion prayer is exactly what it says on the tin. It is a prayer prior to taking communion. The pre-communion prayer having been completed, you now have, well, you guessed it, actual communion itself. And so everybody present, Levites and or congregation, the priest, etc., takes communion, after which there is a fifth offering of incense. And by now, I mean, somebody's got to be calling the fire department, I would figure. Following the fifth offering of incense, you have a hymn of thanksgiving. So these folks seem to like their music because, of course, now music has appeared 3 or 4 times in the Eucharist as part of the offertory, as part of hymns prior to the creed, and of course now we've got a hymn of thanksgiving. When the hymn of thanksgiving is complete, a deacon then comes forth and calls upon the people to be charitable to the poor, and this is when they take up a collection. So, I mean, hey, they're doing it half decently. They're not requiring money prior to the central element of the Mass. You get to take communion, and then they're hitting you up for cash, as it were. So the deacon calls upon the people to be charitable to the poor, and a collection is taken up. And this is significant, which is gathered up by the female knights and priests. This is a cross-section of hospitallers, knights, and canons. So once again, I mentioned before that canons are typically priests. This is made more explicit here. And of course, everything here, this is specifically gathered up by the female knights and priests. So once again, you have that explicit inclusion of women within the orders and initiatory degrees of the church, which was well ahead of its time by quite a bit. So kudos to them. The collection having been gathered up, you then have the final blessing of the Eucharist, or rather the final blessing in the Eucharist, the blessing of the congregation or the Levites and all those present. So that, in as much of a nutshell as I can possibly make it, is the holy sacrifice of the Mass, or Eucharist, according to the primitive church. Now, just a couple additional thoughts and historical notes where the AJC is concerned. The AJC translated the Gospels according to the primitive church about 10 years ago. And I mentioned in part 1 of this talk, of course, that the Gospels according to the primitive church are made available. We've translated them and printed them, and you can get yourself a copy, and I highly recommend you do so. We also translated the Eucharist, which of course is what I was working from when going over this structure. But we decided that it wasn't enough, of course, to translate this Eucharist, which we did also about a decade ago. We actually went ahead and performed it, and so we did the Mass of the primitive church formally at Conclave in Sydney, Australia, and in 2012. And it's definitely a little bit of a throwback, because obviously some of the language is very traditional. Some of the language and structure is old school, and particularly the way things are worded and presented, there's a very Masonic element to it, a very kind of formal and fraternal language. That said, it was an enjoyable experience, I think, by everybody who was present. The thing that was particularly agonizing, though, of course, was the creed that you have right in the center of the Mass. So, I mean, we're dealing with almost the better part of a decade now, and I can't remember if we had used their creed, what they call the symbol of the Apostolic faith, or we had used the profession that you find it in the AJC Eucharist these days, which, if you've ever attended one of our masses, more often than not, the one we use is the one that starts with "What makes us free is the gnosis." So we did do the actual Mass of the Primitive Church back in 2012 in a Josephite monastery as an interesting kind of throwback to the history and kind of continuity of this tradition. I'm not sure, and it's certainly borne out by our history, that this is a Eucharist that you would find us doing regularly, but at the same time, it's an important connection to the history and tradition of the kind of Johannite church and Johannite stream, of which we are one of the spiritual descendants are. We don't claim to be the sole successor of Palaprat's church, and as we go on into section 4 dealing with the legacy, I'm going to kind of take a look at why I don't think anybody can legitimately claim that. But that said, the lineage and the lineage has come down to us in a tactile fashion, and of course the tradition has come down to us in a documentary fashion, with this material, with the translation of the Gospels. So it's something we're mindful of. It's a part of our heritage, and so we felt it was important to actually enact this ritual with the church in the present day. So I alluded to and promised earlier that we would take a quick exploration of temple elements as found in the Eucharist of the primitive church and the primitive church itself. And we're going to take a quick run through that now. If you're not familiar with the temple theology hypothesis and scholarship done and continuing to be done by Dr. Margaret Barker, I highly recommend you spend some time with our YouTube channel or with our audio podcast, The Lectern, as there are a couple of excellent talks by Bishop Tim Mansfield, the AJC's Bishop of New South Wales, who explores this whole hypothesis and history from a few different angles and emphasis. And then once you've done that, of course, you can come back here and you can take a look at these elements and see whether or not, your take or interpretation agrees with some of the interpretations and kind of spotting that we've done here. The other thing is that would be helpful in terms of understanding the kind of temple elements is that I dedicated a section on temple elements in the myth of the Johannite Church, or the myth of the Order of the Temple, in my previous talk, the second talk in this series, the Johannite Tradition Part 2, Digging Under the Temple Mount. And from there we look at a little bit of the structure of the church and a whole lot of the legend and some of the temple elements that come out of the legend. For now, we're going to just slightly recap a couple of those things and then look at the temple elements in light of some of the things that have been presented and discussed specifically in this presentation about the primitive church. So once again, in terms of temple elements, you've got temple elements, in my opinion, that are found throughout the catechisms, the Mass, and the general structure and approach of the primitive church, namely the focus on the Levites. The Levites, of course, in religious history, are the priestly and temple tribe, and the Johannite church, that is to say the primitive church, centers all their orders and their initiatory ranks around the idea of being Levites. That is, Levite is a qualifier to every order and degree. They're not just a deacon, a priest, or a bishop. They're a Levite deacon, a Levite priest, and a Levite bishop. And I think this is in part, as I noted earlier, not the idea that they're establishing a new priesthood as such in a new church, but that they're restoring an old priesthood, or bringing to the forefront an eternal priesthood of an eternal church, as it were. The other thing, of course, in temple theology is that Margaret Barker says that the Second Temple is essentially a corruption of temple practice. By temple practice, she's referring to the First Temple. And the Johannite legend, as noted in the material as it's presented in the Catechism and in its kind of condensed form that you have in the institutional narrative, something of which we use in the Mass of the AJC, that this Johannite legend claims to restore the true or eternal priesthood rather than Christ making an eternal priesthood. So they're drawing that connection, as I've noted, not simply back to Christ through this lineage, but further back to the Temple of Jerusalem, and further back yet still into Egypt. And of course, the primitive church throughout uses a Jewish lunar calendar to kind of continue that Old Testament feel, as it were. Another element that Barker emphasizes throughout her examination of temple theology is the Second Temple being a corruption of First Temple practice. The Second Temple dropped, forgot, or discarded some elements that were found in the Temple of Solomon, making the ritual that they did in the Second Temple to be incomplete or corrupt, essentially, by that standard. And one of those, of course, is the thing around the high priest of the temple. That in the First Temple, the high priest is anointed, but in the Second Temple, the anointing and the anointing oil is no longer present. In the primitive church, there's an emphasis not only on the temple priesthood and temple ideas, but the sovereign pontiff himself, the sovereign pontiff of the Eglise, of the church, is referred to specifically in their title, in their honorific, as being anointed. Another thing that you find present throughout the legend, throughout the catechisms, and of course in the ideas of Margaret Barker, is that all of them speak of Christ essentially having some kind of learning or connection to Egypt. And in history, this idea of the temple or temple practice being connected to Egypt is not entirely far-fetched, because there were two Jewish temples, or two temples that were operating in Jewish practice of the day, present in actual Egypt. The names escape me, but I've included them. I've listed them in the second part of my talk for the medieval Johannite legend. So you can have a look at that, or of course you can dig into Margaret Barker herself. And lastly, and as is made apparent at several points throughout the Mass of the primitive church, and also within the catechisms of the degrees of the primitive church, is that the Eucharist is a sacrifice for the support of the law, or the covenant would be another term we could use for that, and that the Eucharist is a reconciling ritual. It's a holocaust, and that of, which is the word or phrase that they use to essentially describe the temple offering of the First Temple. So they're drawing a specific line or a specific connection between the Eucharist as a ritual and the Temple of Solomon, something, of course, that lines up completely well with the ideas that Margaret Barker presents. The reason why this lines up so well and so explicitly is because this comes down essentially to part of Margaret Barker's central thesis, the idea that Christian liturgy is a continuation or a restoration, not of Second Temple, not an evolution or innovation on Second Temple liturgy and ritual, but an actual restoration or continuation of the theology found in the First Temple ritual. All right, deep breath, people. We are now at the final section of the final part of this talk. After about 3 hours, I suspect there is probably nobody left, but here we are. We are going to get over the finish line. So the last section of this third part in the Johannite tradition talk, or rather the the third part of the third part, and the fourth section overall in this talk is entitled Section 4: Rivals, Schism, and Legacy. In other words, what was the climate around the organization at that time? What was the climate inside as the organizations developed and added things throughout their growth? And of course, what is the legacy through to the present day? So rivals, schism, and legacy. So the first part of this final section, section 4, is simply on rivals. Did the primitive church of the Order of the Temple have any real rivals or competition in its time? Were there other organizations doing some version of what they did that essentially were competing for members or money or airtime or any of those kind of things? And it seems to me, and I mean, there are other people, certainly both within and without the AJC, that have a better knowledge of this time period than I do. So you get what I've got, which may or may not be much, right? Hey, it's free. So as far as I can tell, from everything I know about the organization in my current level of knowledge and everything I know about the context, the primitive church in its day really had very little, if any, in the way of actual rivals or competition. It was essentially at the forefront of its own movement at the time, and I think I've been able to successfully kind of underline or draw attention to that point by noting that, while in terms of not always being, divergent, starkly divergent or heretical in some of its theologies or ideas, enough so to make it Gnostic as we would understand it, certainly in terms of its social practice and some of its inclusive theology, it was ahead of its time, and there really isn't a whole lot of other churches, small or large, at its time that was doing anything like it in their own sphere. There is one kind of point we can make. There was a Gallican church that would come out later from some of the members of the Order of the Temple and the Primitive Church, and indeed they would share some clergy that presumably was doing its own kind of independent French national church or independent French church. And notably, the one kind of significant overlapping clergy in that regard is a gentleman by the name of Ferdinand Toussaint Châtel. Châtel would be would become the primate of the order / primate of the church, so one of the ranking bishops in the 1830s. And he was also a bishop in an independent French church. But other than that, there wasn't a whole lot of rivalry or competition or even comparable organizations for its time. Of course, when you raise the question of rivals, you also raise the question of the opposition or enemies. Did it really have any? Not explicitly. I mean, politically, of course, because some of the leadership of the Primitive Church and Order of the Temple were ranking Freemasons, and Freemasonry at the time, of course, had some varying political involvement and connotations and overlap. So there is a little bit of opposition, but it's not as such to the Primitive Church and the Order of the Temple. It is, however, some of the difficulties encountered by some of the leaders in their own lifetime. And fabre-palaprat was jailed at one point for political reasons. But I don't think this was owing, as I recall anyway, to the actual Primitive Church or Order of the Temple. If you want a little bit more detail on the circumstances that some of the members found themselves in as the government and social environment of France around the Primitive Church and Order of the Temple began to shift yet again, go see the talk on our YouTube channel or podcast that specifically deals with kind of the biography and life of fabre-palaprat. So while the Primitive Church and the Order of the Temple didn't really have a lot in the way of explicit enemies, opposed to that specific operation, it did, however, set up for itself some implied mythological or legendary adversaries. And namely, some of this stuff comes out of the legend. Now, rolling things back and taking a look at the legend, of course, what you're dealing with is an alleged secret line or lineage of Templar Grand Masters that are passing on this Johannite tradition, and both this lineage of Templar Grand Masters and the Johannite Church comes up to the modern age and into the hands of fabre-palaprat. So, and this lineage in legend, one of the primary sources of authority or impetus for it of course, is the Charter of L'arminius. And the Charter of L'arminius has a notable bit in it where it anathematizes or essentially condemns the Scottish Templars. So immediately what you have now is you now have a France versus Scotland thing kind of implied in the legend. Whether or not there was an actual rivalry, that simply, I don't have enough to form a definitive hypothesis here, but they are setting themselves up for something. The reason why this is significant, why it's worth noting that the Charter of L'arminius condemns Scottish Templarism, is that in the same century, being the 18th century or the 1700s properly, is that you actually have the rise of the association between Templar continuation, Templar ideas, Freemasonry, and particularly Scottish Freemasonry. So throughout the 18th century, you have the rise of essentially Scottish Templar and Masonic Templar legends. And some of these, of course, connect to Bonnie Prince Charlie, Charles Edward Stuart, the Young Pretender, as he is known, of course, the central cause of the Jacobites, coming for the Latin for James, which is a reference to Bonnie Prince Charlie's father, who was a claimant to the throne. You've also got, of course, the famous oration of the Chevalier Ramsay, who specifically makes connections between Templarism and Freemasonry. You have in that time the rise of the rite of strict observance, which was a Masonic rite that claimed an explicit Templar connection or Templar restoration through a secret lineage that passes through Scotland. In Freemasonry, of course, you also have some of the Templar associated degrees in the Scottish Rite, for example, Knight Kadosh. Now, interestingly enough, as anybody who has a basic understanding of Masonic history knows, the Scottish Rite is actually French. So we're not going to pick that all apart. But needless to say, there are now, in this same time period in which the primitive church and the order of the temple are supposedly existing, at least since 1705, if you believe their own accounts, and for surety at least from 1804, that in that 100-year period you have the rise of a lot of Templar legends, Templar survival, connections between Templars and Freemasonry, and specifically connections between Scotland Templars and Freemasonry. In addition, of course, to the Rite of Strict Observance, you also have the successor of the Rite of Strict Observance, which is the Knights Beneficent of the Holy City, which is essentially a Martinist rite, or a branch of Martinism, that took over the Rite of Strict Observance, kept a lot of the Templar and Masonic connections, but then incorporated the cosmology and doctrine of the Elu Cohen, which was the magical Masonic system or theurgic system of Martinez de Pasquale. Of course, additional legend that you have come around this time, we have ideas emerging that, in terms of Scottish national identity here, going back to the 13th and 14th centuries, at least historical wise, not necessarily with the legend and the narrative, but of course, a lot of us know the story that Robert the Bruce defeated the English. Well, it's in the 18th century that excuse me, it's in the 18th century that a legend begins to emerge that the one of the reasons why Robert the Bruce was able to prevail over the English is because he had help from the Templars. So, like I said, you begin to see a lot of these Scottish, Templar, and Masonic ideas weave together in this same time period that you have a French organization coming out of the woodwork and saying, we are the continuation of the Templars. The Scottish have a continuation of the Templars, but those Scottish Templars are bad because in our eyes, they're deserters. So, finally, as mentioned, to kind of wrap this up in terms of mythological or actual adversaries, the L'arminius Charter, believed to be a forgery and likely originated in this overlapping primitive church time, sometime between the claimed 1705 order to the 1804/1812 restoration. It attacks the Scottish Templars as deserter. So we're dealing with a little bit of a chicken and egg here thing, that clearly the Johannite tradition, as expounded by the primitive church, has a degree of supposed historical antagonism against a Scottish Templar tradition, and at the same time, they're essentially tooting this horn about the wrongs, the historical wrongs, or the historical illegitimacy of the Scottish Templars, as opposed to invalidity. That this actual kind of Scottish Templar tradition is coming up through Masonic, fraternal, and esoteric circles contemporary at that time. So the question that needs to be asked, and that I don't have an answer to, is, did the Scottish Templar tradition predate the Johannite tradition of Scottish Templars being bad, or did it rise at the same time, or did it definitively come afterwards? In other words, was the primitive church, through the Larminius Charter, railing against a pre-existing rival or enemy, or was it just trying to create historical context to give itself a little bit more of the appearance of historical actuality or legitimacy? The ultimate thing is that we don't know the answer, but I do think it's interesting to contemplate that essentially you have these two aspects coming up alongside each other at the same time, and at least in the narrative of one, there's antagonism towards the other. Now we come to everybody's favorite subject, schism. You know what they say, wherever there's an ism, there's a schism. And sure enough, when strong personalities are involved, sometimes there are significant splits, and sometimes there are significant disagreements, and sometimes there are significant disagreements that result in significant splits. And sure enough, there was a break in these organizations. So the Order of the Temple endured a schism. And now previously, I've kind of linked these organizations together because they have an overlapping structure. They have one leader that's the leader over of them both. And functionally, throughout the majority of their life, they operated as one. At least once the Johannite Church had come around, they had kind of operated as one for the majority of the time of both of their existences. Now we actually have, as a result of the imposition of the faith of the primitive church, in other words, the imposition of an actual religion upon the members of the Order of the Temple, with this connection with the primitive church, the Order of the Temple has a schism. The primitive church itself didn't schism, to my knowledge, and continued to have Bernard-Raymond, fabre-palaprat, as its founder and its leader. But the Order of the Temple did in fact schism as a result of having the Johannite Church, or the primitive church, pushed upon it. And so one side was led by a French noble whose title I can't pronounce because my French is incredibly bad, the Duc de Choiseul, we'll say. I'm pretty sure I just butchered that. And the other, of course, the Johannitist branch, let's say, was led by fabre-palaprat. Now, I haven't included in my notes the more kind of fine-grained reasons as to why, and of course, because you have a lot of stories that emerge from this era, people present this schism in slightly different ways. But essentially, there were a lot of folks at the time within the order that still functionally considered themselves to be decent Catholics. Now, whether that's Catholic in the sense of the Roman Catholic Church, or Catholic in the sense of the state church or constitutional church that I made mention of earlier, history is not clear. I don't know. And certainly the state church or civil constitution of the clergy continued to be Catholic as such, having the sacraments, having the doctrine and dogmas, but separating itself out from the authority of the papacy. So when the schism happened, essentially you've got members of the Order of the Temple who still viewed themselves as fundamentally being Catholic, and they couldn't accept some of the ideas that were presented to them for explicit explicit assent. In other words, they had to agree to this. And they couldn't, it seems, in good conscience, believing themselves to be good Catholics, they couldn't accept some of the ideas put forth by the primitive church. Whether, of course, that means, swearing some kind of oath or obligation to the sovereign pontiff and patriarch of a secret line of the real true church. I mean, certainly that might ruffle some feathers, or simply the ideas or lack of ideas on heaven and hell, or perhaps universal salvation. There are any number of ideas that would have caused a clash with the Catholicism of its day. While the primitive church wasn't explicitly Gnostic, it was, by Catholic standards, explicitly heterodox and heretical. So essentially, because of the primitive church, you have a split in the Knights Templar. And one side was led by the Duc de Choiseul, the other side was led by Palaprat, who in the end, after his death, would be succeeded by Admiral Sir William Sidney Smith as regent. And the two halves would later reconcile after Palaprat died, and it seems that Palaprat, probably because of the ferocity of his claims, in terms of being the Church of John, the successor of John, and so forth, that Palaprat seems to be kind of the nexus point or the eye of the storm when it comes to the controversy in terms of the primitive church versus the Catholic Church. So after Palaprat dies in 1838, the two halves of this schism in the Order of the Temple reconcile. Unfortunately, however, that reconciliation was only to last for so long, and eventually it would split. And this time, the Order of the Temple would shatter into 100 pieces, most of which continue on to the present day, or rather originate in the present day, as it were. But we will get to that in the last section on legacy. Well, some congratulations are in order, because we have, in fact, made it to the functional last slide of this talk. There is one more slide after it, and this, of course, is a list of sources and resources. So if you're mindful to dig in more and see some of this stuff with your own eyes, and take a look at the different ideas you have on it, I welcome you to do so, and that, of course, is listed as the last slide. So this functional last slide, however, brings us to an important question and an important answer, and that's the question of legacy. We've looked at the structure, we've looked at the context, we've looked at the beliefs and figures and dates. The last question to ask, of course, is where did it all go, and what does that mean in the present day? And that, of course, is the question of legacy. Now, the issue of legacy and what happened after all of this is complicated and interwoven enough that really it probably could stand to have its own talk. We don't really have the time to do that here. That said, it's a question that can't be ignored, so I'm going to try and untangle it and treat it as straightforward and as briefly as I can without cutting any corners. So before we dive into it, I think there's one thing that's important to bear in mind as we look at the legacy of the primitive church and the Order of the Temple, and whether or not it continues or continued to the present day. And the important distinction that we need to look at is the difference between lineage and authority. And perhaps a quick example will kind of illustrate the difference that I'm talking about when we talk about lineage or authority. Now, there are a lot of modern Gnostic churches in the present day. There are even more independent sacramental churches in the present day. There are liberal Catholic churches, and so on and so forth. Most of them, as a part of their kind of spiritual patrimony, they have a lineage. They have one or more lineages that trace back to and through, for example, the Roman Catholic Church. But being ordained in one of these churches in the lineage of the Roman Catholic Church does not, in fact, make you a Roman Catholic bishop. In order to be a Roman Catholic bishop, you have to be ordained by a Roman Catholic bishop for service in the Roman Catholic bishop. There's a pretty clear distinction here. So a lot of these churches and ordinations can legitimately trace to the Roman Catholic Church, but that doesn't mean that these churches or these bishops are, in fact, Roman Catholic churches or Roman Catholic bishops. And so this distinction between lineage, descent, and actual authority or continued existence is something that we see played out for the legacy of the primitive church and the Order of the Temple. It is, in fact, a key issue. So in terms of the Order of the Temple, there are dozens of modern or Neo-Templar orders that can trace their lineage back to Palaprat's Order of the Temple as we have discussed it. Or they trace their lineage to one of the groups or figures that have descended from it, or they trace their lineage to one of the many splits from those many groups. Functionally, it amounts to the same thing, that the majority of the modern Templar or Neo-Templar orders can trace their lineage back to fabre-palaprat. However, there is no record of continuous operation for fabre-palaprat's Order of the Temple, or continuous operation. The only actual evidence or historical traces we have are essentially a series of lineage branches, a series of name changes, a series of schisms, and a series of competing regency claims. That is to say, these different schismatic or descended groups had their own leaders, their regents or grandmasters, and at several points throughout their history, these different leaders existed and operated in the same time, essentially being rivals. But there actually is no one organization that can either say they are the Order of the Temple continuing to operate through that, from that time to this time, or that they are the sole authoritative successor to those organizations. There simply is no historical basis on which to make that claim. Almost everybody has that lineage and that connection, but nobody actually has a record of authority, and any kind of remnants of records of authority quickly devolves into schism, basically devolves into a set of competing claims with no single claim having evidence to say it is the definitive continuation. In terms of the primitive church, we see a similar issue. The primitive church, in its original form, organizationally, likely lasted, in my opinion, from everything I've looked at, no longer than 1870 or 1880. Its last living bishops having transmitted or ordained those who would serve as bishops in other churches based on historical records. So there is actually no hard evidence to suggest that the primitive church or the Order of the Temple continued to operate through that time to this time without interruption. There is records of lineage that gets passed on without interruption, but there's no actual transmission of definitive authority hand to hand, organization to organization, through to the present day. Now, there are one or two histories that claim that counter to this historical evidence, that there was actually a measure of authority that was passed on by one Johannite bishop to another Gnostic bishop, and that essentially he folded the Johannite church, the primitive church, into that other Gnostic church. But this doesn't actually have much substantiation or hold very much water at all. But, to be fair, before I deal with that claim and its substantiation or that lack thereof, I think it's important, first and foremost, before I deal with the claims of others, that we actually put the question of our own claim on the table transparently. I think that's important for integrity, that if I'm going to talk about the claims or lack thereof of other organizations, that we address the implicit question of our own claim and whether or not it exists. Now, the AJC's founder, the bishop that founded the AJC, and I am not the founder of the AJC, there was somebody before me, the AJC was founded on claimed authority to have the ability to restore it authoritatively. That is, it was claimed that there was authority to suggest that the Apostolic Johannite Church was the legitimate successor of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat's primitive church. Here is the reality, point blank. There is simply no evidence for that. I have never seen it, and I've been around for a while. I was around at the beginning, and I'm around now, and I've had some time to explore the issue throughout that time, and there is simply no evidence for it. What there is evidence of course, is apostolic succession and lineage from fabre-palaprat. There certainly is a record of ordination from bishop to bishop to bishop to bishop, and so on and so forth, going up to my predecessor and then to myself. But the reality is this record of ordination, this record of succession or record of lineage, is no different than the lineages that are possessed by almost every modern Gnostic church or independent sacramental church. Almost everybody has these lineages. And there are more than one, but having more than one doesn't give you an actual additional claim. So there are records of lineage that the AJC has that does in fact go back to fabre-palaprat, but there actually is no evidence to suggest that the AJC is the sole definitive authoritative successor of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat's primitive church. And the reality is no one else has it either. Everybody has the lineage, nobody has the authority. Now, in terms of that counterclaim, in terms of the history, there are generally two central histories that we have that reference with any amount of detail, and most other histories tend to cite these two histories. There are two histories that we have that deal with the issue and legacy of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat's primitive church, and that's Milko Bogaard's History of the Gnostic Church and the more widely cited René Laforster's History of the Église Gnostique, or French Gnostic Church. Here's the thing. In the first case, with the first history, it makes reference to a bishop by the name of Bernard Clement. And Bernard Clement, at the turn of the century, that is to say the 1900s of that time, was a Johannite bishop and supposedly primate of the United States. That history concedes that there's no definitive evidence to back up Clement's claim, or the claim made of him, that he's a Johannite bishop. And in René Laforster's history, we find that same Bishop Clement referenced with the birth date of 1831 and the death date of 1911. Now, here's how the actual kind of counter-historical claim goes. Essentially, as it's been recorded in the lineage, supposedly Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat ordained Bernard Clement, and Bernard Clement ordained a bishop by the name of Jean Bricaud. And that essentially, when Bernard Clement ordained Jean Bricaud, Clement also joined Bricaud's organization, and he essentially folded the Johannite church into Bricaud's church. Now, there are a couple problems. There are a couple actually gaping, significant mathematical holes in all this, and it's a little bit tough to break down, but I'm going to try and give the best summation of it. The first problem is with Clement himself. Number one, there is no actual evidence beyond the narrative stated in these histories for Bernard Clement being a Johannite bishop. The lineage states it because, he was ordained by Palaprat according to the documentation, but there's no documentary evidence besides a line or two in each of these histories to actually say he was a Johannite bishop. The other problem is that when you look at his age and you look at the timeline, we know from our examination of history here, and this is something that is easily verified if you go outside of this talk, we know that Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat died in 1838. This is pretty much universally agreed. And according to the only history that actually provides any detail on Bernard Clement, which is Forster's History of the Église Gnostique, that Clement was born in 1831 and that he died in 1911. So the last possible time, the latest date that Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat could have consecrated or ordained somebody in, the last year that that's possible, because he died, is sometime in 1838. If we take Forster's history as accurate, this means the oldest that Bernard Clement could have been when he was consecrated a bishop was, 7 years old. Now, I don't know about you. I've met some pretty smart kids, some that are, practically prodigies, but I know of no 7-year-old that is talented enough and has their stuff together enough to serve as a bishop at the age of 7. The second problem with all this, of course, comes when you look at the latter end of this transmission. Now, Jean Bruno is a significant figure and linchpin in the history of the modern Gnostic churches and in the French Gnostic Church. And he was ordained by the second patriarch of the Église Gnostique, the refounded French Gnostic Church. And that patriarch went by the name of Tauseniges, a gentleman by the last name of fabre-palaprat. And of course, I'm probably butchering the French, but there you are. Tauseniges succeeded the first patriarch of the French Gnostic Church, the Église Gnostique, who was a gentleman by the name of Jules Doinel. Jules Doinel wasn't actually ordained or received lineage from any outside or mainstream church, much in the same way that, for example, Palaprat was. Doinel didn't actually have this. How Doinel got his lineage and authority is that he had essentially a visionary experience in which he was ordained by long-dead Cathar bishops. And it was from the authority or veracity or belief around that visionary experience that he went on to form his church and ordained new bishops. So he ordained the gentleman, based on this vision, he ordained the gentleman that ordained Jean Bricaud. So up until this point, the Église Gnostique didn't have a mainstream recognized lineage from another source. And we know this because the first person to actually receive this outside ordination, specifically in the lineage of the Roman Catholic Church, to bring this into the Gnostic Church, the first person to receive this was that Jean Bricaud in 1913. And it's a significant event because it's been remarked on by histories ever since, that this is essentially when the French Gnostic Church received a measure of outside legitimacy by the reception of mainstream Western apostolic succession. Now, we know from the histories that we've looked at here, and you can go outside of the talk and look at it for verification, but we know that the figures who ordained the people who would start the primitive church, we know they came from the Roman Catholic Church because they were bishops in the French constitutional church. In other words, the church that was, the clergy in the church that was brought under the authority of the French state. So these were Roman Catholic priests and bishops that were basically taken in under the authority of the state to have a state church. But functionally, the lineage of the ordination is that of the Roman Catholic Church because those were the people they were taking in. So if Clement, who was ordained in the lineage, by all accounts ordained in the lineage of the Roman Catholic Church, had actually transmitted that authority to Jean Bricaud, it would have been worthy of note because Jean Bricaud's other transmission from the Roman Catholic Church was significant and worthy of note, and that took place in 1913. According to these dates from René Le Forster, of course, in addition to being possibly a 7-year-old bishop, is that Bernard Clement died in 1911. So if this outside mainstream transmission had happened earlier than 1913, it would be that event that we have on record of significance for the injection of authority or legitimacy, as it were, into the French Gnostic movement. But it is, of course, a later and other consecration in 1913 that we remember Jean Bricaud by. The other question, of course, is, in addition to not having any solid historical basis to say that Clement was a Johannite bishop, and that if he was, he would have been a 7-year-old bishop, is that by the time, of course, he reaches Jean Bricaud's time, he would have been quite ancient. That's a whole other story. Now, there's an additional problem that you can pile on to this tangle. So, according to the counter-narrative, essentially, Clement was a Johannite bishop, 7 years old or not, and he passed on his authority to Jean Bricaud. And further, he turned around and said, this Johannite church that I'm a part of, I'm actually taking it and I'm joining it and I'm putting it under the authority of Jean Bricaud's organization. Jean Bricaud, in turn, his organization would end up becoming descending and becoming another Gnostic church. And that organization would end up descending and becoming yet another Gnostic church. And that organization would end up descending and becoming another Gnostic church. And you guessed it, that organization would descend and again transform into another Gnostic church. So you have a series of schisms, you have a series of descent, and you have a very long series of name changes. So the question becomes is that even if Clement had the authority and the ability to not only pass on the Johannite lineage, but pass on the Johannite authority, there still remains the question of whether or not the people who claim that in the present day are in fact the same organization that had it transferred to them 100 years prior. So in order for the claim for any organization in the present day based on this narrative to be true, you actually need 5 or 6 things in a row to be true. And the further you go back in history, of course, and in some cases the further you go forward in history, the less likely this becomes. So in order for this present day claim or counter narrative to be true, 5 or 6 things in a row have to line up. And if one of them is false, it turns out the entire claim is false. So in the end, this is why I say that there is a record of lineage, but there's no record of authority. It just doesn't hold up. It's too flimsy. There's too many what ifs. There's too many unsubstantiated claims. There's too many repeated claims without evidence or footnote in order to actually say definitively that any of those people in the present day are the sole definitive continuer of the primitive church. So this, of course, this overall picture leaves us in a bind legacy-wise. And that question comes down to this. In terms of somebody who finds the modern Johannite tradition, or perhaps the whole spectrum of the Johannite tradition, but the modern Johannite tradition, of course, is a stone in that pathway, so it becomes important. In terms of somebody who is interested and exploring Johannite spirituality and working with a community in the Johannite tradition, which community do they join and where do they go? And ultimately, it's not lineage that's going to provide that answer, because pretty much everybody has that lineage. And it's not authority that's going to provide that answer, because no one has that authority. So it boils down to one thing. And as Gnostics and Gnostic churches, of course, it boils down to the thing that it's always been, is that the last determinant of authority for someone's individual spiritual path is the individual themselves. So if you're looking at the Johannite tradition, if you're looking at that continuum of narrative or myth or legend, or the principles and beliefs that are espoused throughout this wider journey of the Johannite tradition, if you're looking at that and you're saying, you know, these are beliefs, these are principles, this is a narrative that I share, you know, and I want to not only draw from it and continue it, that the only person that can determine where to go or where to place one's efforts, well, is you. It's not me. It's not a bishop from another church. It's not our church or another church organization that has the right or the ability to definitively tell you where to go and what to do. It is only you that can do that. So in order to do that, you have to look at these different communities and what they're doing. You know, number one, do they have a community? Number two, what are the people like in the community? Number three, who are the leaders of these communities and what kind of people are they? Number four, does their leaders, their communities, or their organization operate in line with the principles that you've seen? The principles and the ideas and the myths and narratives and symbols of the primitive church as we understand it, as we've looked at it in this church. You know, look at the communities, look at the leaders, look at their activity and their structures and their belief and the type of things that they do and make use of, and determine for yourself in which, if you're interested in the Johannite tradition, look for yourself and say, who best embodies this in the modern day? Who is actually doing the work? And ultimately, the only person that can make that determination is you. So all of that having been said, we are now in fact at the end of the talk, and I want to thank you for not only your interest in exploring the Johannite tradition, particularly in its modern era, but also for your patience and your fortitude in managing to come all the way through all that to the very end. That's no small feat. As we are recording this in a time of global pandemic, and as you're likely listening to it in that same time, please take my wish, of course, for your continued health and well-being, and I hope to see you happy and successful on the other side of this very uncertain time. May God bless you and keep you, and on behalf of the Apostolic Johannite Church, all the best.